Hi, I'm Jessica. Oh no, okay. That's my dog Lucy. I'm Jessica. I go to Newton South High School. I'm helping out Valerie with this event. Oh no, I'm sorry. One second.
I'm Jen. I don't have a dog. We'll just
I have my cat right there.
That's right. We can go back to listening to oh the dog getting ousted. Nice.
So Lucy will be joining me on the chair next to me. Um, I'm Jessica. I also go to Newton South with Valerie. And yeah, Jen, would you like to introduce yourself a little?
Sure. Well, the most important thing is that I went to high school with Valerie's mom, Lila, forever ago, which is, I guess, how I ended up doing this, which is cool. I wrote a book, She the People. I also have a copy back there, which is what they tell you on Room Raiders. You're supposed to have one copy of your book in the background, otherwise you look conceited. I kind of stumbled into writing a book. It wasn't something I had actually ever planned to do. I started out, I used to be a performer. I did stand-up comedy in New York for a long time. I studied theater at Emerson way back in the day. And but then I sort of fell in with a bunch of writers on Twitter, among other things. And I also had started a Facebook page to advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, which I have that. And one of the things I learned from doing the page is how little people knew about the Equal Rights Amendment and what it actually was, even people who were advocates for it. So it started with I thought about doing maybe some posts on the page, and then it became a book. And then it became, first it was just going to be about the initial battle for the ERA, and then I thought, oh, I have to keep going back. And so it sort of so now it ended up going from 1776 to now. And to 2018 because I wrote it then. Yeah, and other than that, I write other things and yeah, and stuff like that. I have a 16-year-old also, and yeah, and who's in the other room hiding and hoping I'm not too embarrassing. We'll see.
Nice, I can relate.
And I made sure that I'm showing cleavage in honor of the girls in Florida whose cleavage was crossed out by the black bar. I wouldn't normally show this much cleavage for a professional thing, but it felt important in solidarity with those girls. Just so you know.
And why did you think it was important to tell these stories?
Well, one of the things when I told the stories, one of the things I really wanted to make sure I did was to embed them into the overall story of American history, because a lot of times women's history was getting told as like, there's U.S. history and then there's women's history, and that's even been in shelving the book. It becomes like some people put it with U.S. history. It's usually put in women's studies, even though you can write a book about like some guy who sailed a ship, and that'll go in the U.S. history section, and then my book that covers all of U.S. history goes in the women's studies. So it's so I want to make sure I had the contextualize of that. I think I'm amazed at how much people don't know. And the other thing was a lot of times, and this has been addressed in recent, like last year was the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and this did get talked about a lot, but that also women's history was white women, and then Sojourner Truth. It would be like that, white women and Sojourner Truth. And I wanted to make sure that everyone, because so many people had worked on this stuff, I wanted to make sure that there were a wide variety of the stories that were told. Yeah, and the other thing that happened was after the 2016 election, not only was I motivated by the fact that there'd been all this animosity against a woman running for president, but also it made me realize how little people understood civics or how the government works and like what the president does, that kind of thing, what the president can do. So I wanted to also make sure it focused on that as much as possible, on the idea of how things change, how focusing on the women behind the scenes, because often the changes women were making were done, you know, in the back hallways of legislatures and things. So that was a big part of it. And also I was concerned as a white woman about other white women who seemed to not know stuff and needed to know stuff. I won't go into more detail, but that was part of my motivation too. Maybe I'll go into detail later.
So where did you learn about these untold stories that most people hadn't heard of? And what is it like writing them?
So some of the stuff I learned early. My mother was in the League of Women Voters, working on the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 70s. She wanted to make sure I knew, you know, who Susan B. Anthony was, and Victoria Woodhull, and people like that. And I did grow up in Brookline, and so there was a certain amount of attempt to tell some other stories. I mean, when I was in high school, I was in the school within a school, which was the very alternative, and our main history book for U.S. history was Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And then later I was like, oh wait, I don't really know about George Washington. So some of it was that. And then I just started, once you start down this road, like you start reading stories, and then you start noticing that someone's mentioned another time, and then think, oh wait, this person must, and it starts leading. I get obsessive, and so, which is really important if you're writing a book, to be, especially if it's a nonfiction book, to be able to be very obsessive about things. And so it led down, there were a lot of rabbit holes, and in fact I had to make myself stop reading things and watching documentaries and things at a certain point when I was writing the book, because I would sort of go like, oh wait, I have to put this in, and it was like, no, I only have 50,000 words. There was, for me, the really interesting thing about writing history is I always knew intellectually that there's a certain bias always to writing, just because who writes the history, what they're interested in, and writing. I mean, it was when I was sitting there choosing what was going to go in, that was kind of intimidating at times, a little, like, I had to, like, what gives me the right to decide what goes in. And but I had to give myself a certain amount of permission to just write about. I mean, the nice thing about writing 1776 to 2018 is that I knew there was no way I was going to talk about everything that had ever happened in those years. So it gave me, like, I spent a lot of time on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and that's totally me. That was not, most historians telling the story would not have chosen to focus on the Dick Van Dyke Show quite as much as I did. Not that I devoted a lot, but more than many would have. I did, as a white woman, it was, I had to be very careful, I thought, about sharing stories about Black women, about Asian American women, about other people, just so that I wasn't too familiar. There was a point where I was referring to all of the women in the book by their first names a lot. And then I felt very uncomfortable doing that with the Black women I was talking about. I didn't really feel comfortable calling Harriet Tubman Harriet. It felt inappropriate. And I went back and changed the names just for that reason. And so then it wasn't, and so I did that as little as possible. The other choice I made, and it started sort of as a sort of a fluke, and then it became like a challenge, is that I don't name men. There are very few men, except for there's Dick Van Dyke, who's named, but that's partially because the show has his name in it. And Bill Clinton gets named, which I justified because he was almost the first husband. And so I talked about a lot of first ladies. And so I was like, okay, I can make it. But I tried as much as possible, and it became sort of a game, refer to the presidents as, like Abigail Adams' husband did this, or Eleanor Roosevelt's husband did this. And it was sort of a joke to myself, but it was also became a challenge, because so often, people will refer to, so-and-so and his wife. And so I wanted to kind of flip it a little. Yeah. So that was very, yeah, it was just, and it was scary. And I actually was just describing it in something I wrote recently as, I don't know if you've read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. or that series, in one of the books, Arthur Dent, the main character, figures out that the way to fly is if you're falling, if you get distracted before you hit the ground, you won't fall all the way and you'll start to fly. And then, which of course doesn't actually work, but that's how I felt the whole time I was writing the book. I had to, it was like, I just have to just write it and just be distracted by something else and not think about the fact that I'm writing this huge book. Yeah.
I think part of your response leads in nicely to the next question, which is, what is the importance of own voice writing? That's where you're writing something about a community, and you're part of that same community. What do you think is the importance of that, and what are also some challenges of doing that?
So that becomes hard because, of course, I was talking about lots of different communities. I think it's important to, if you're writing about people not of your community, to first of all acknowledge that up front. I tried to hone. I mean, the book it's very much in my voice as much as possible, which maybe helps with that because it's very clear that I'm talking as myself, I guess. It's a tricky question. It's hard to, I don't know if I can give very specific actions. It's just a matter of making sure that you're respectful. I mean, I think I did probably end up making fewer jokes about people who weren't white. Like, I think that was probably something I did without even thinking about it, for instance. Like, I think that but in general, writing about people who are dead or who you don't know is just all over is just strange. I mean, I kept thinking about how strange, and here I am describing these people. I don't know that they were like that. I never met any of these people. Well, Hillary Clinton, I shook her hand, but other than that, I haven't met anyone. And it seems very like it's very presumptuous in general to write about anybody in writing history. So I had to like a little bit take on, they have the to have the confidence of a mediocre white man. I tried to I was like, all right, maybe I can try to be a little bit as confident as that. At some point you just have to write. And I tried to look at, make sure I used respectful terms and so I mean, it was, so there was that. It's this, and I think I succeeded. I did get one complaint on Goodreads. Everyone else said mostly good things about it on Goodreads, except one person, which is the one I focus on forever. But where they complain that I talk about Sally Hemings when she goes to Paris with Thomas Jefferson. And that's when they start having sexual intercourse. And in the book, I describe very clearly that in France, she was not enslaved legally because slavery didn't exist in France. And also the age of consent was low. And so there was no, so all of it was the sort of legally she could consent in Paris. And yet there was a complaint that I made it sound like that, but she was enslaved, she couldn't consent. And so it's like, I was like, I understand that I was nitpicking at it, but it also becomes central to her story that to an extent she chooses that. And so, and the only reason I felt comfortable telling that story is because I had, I have the backing of Annette Gordon-Reed in her book, The Hemings of Monticello, which goes into it in much more detail. But because it does feel presumptuous, and I qualify, like, I don't know what Sally Hemings was thinking. And I don't know what any of these people were thinking. Like, it's all this sort of passed down stories that we hear. And yeah, so it's you just have to, at some point you just kind of just write it and just, pray that it's not too terrible. And then you wait for people to complain, which they do. Yeah. So.
Well, what were some reactions to your writing other than negative reactions? Have there been any like really touching reactions that you've gotten from people who've read your book?
Yeah, I mean, I've been, um, I love like there's a feminist bookstore in the Assembly Row Mall of all places, which is this great outdoor mall in Somerville. It's called All She Wrote Books, and I had a great I'm as an author, you actually go in. It's good for you and for the bookstores, independent bookstores, to go in, say hi, and then offer to sign books, and then everyone posts about it on social media. So this is a thing I do, especially if there's a lot of bookstores around here. So I popped in and said, "Oh, hey, I'm Jen Deaderick. I wrote the book She the People," and the woman who runs it was just like, "Oh, I love that book," and I was like, it's funny that this thing that I just wrote sitting at my desk is out there in the world, and I'd never met her, and she read it and she liked it. And so that's a kind of a cool, like, every once in a while I think that's great, like people, I'll die eventually, and there's this book that just people will read, and so that's kind of been powerful. I get, and people write, every once in a while I get, tagged in a post, or people, write to me, online or something like that. And so that's cool. My other favorite thing is, and I know your mom, Valerie's mom, Lila, knows these people, is Laura Vana and Lacey Berman, who we also grew up with. They have this thing called Girl Pickers, which is they sell vintage stuff, but they sell my book, and they have this little, it's like a cubicle at a big, like a vintage wares store that's in Stoughton. And I went out there one day just because they have my book there, and I will sign it for them. I don't know if I was dropping them off or something. I go in, and people were like, all these women who work there were like psyched, and they had put it up at the front desk. And so it's like, it's kind of like, and I go, but it's just this thing. I don't know. I just sat, so it's cool. And I've liked that a lot. And and it makes me feel like I did what I hoped to do, which was communicate the stories in a way that was somewhat compelling to people. So, which is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what are some hurdles that you encountered during the process of writing and publishing your book?
Well, I was working on it. I just came out. I was putting together my YouTube channel, as one does, and I didn't realize was at Radcliffe 7 years ago. Gail Collins, the columnist, for the New York Times, she was giving a talk, and I guess I got up and asked a question, and in the question I prefaced it by saying, "I'm working on a cartoon history of the Equal Rights Amendment." And so that was 7 years ago. And it was so fun. Like there were, I was tried, it was going to be a cartoon thing. So it was like a 7-year thing. It was years and years. Doing the research was difficult, although I think my favorite part. But I went through a divorce. I moved a bunch of times. There were all these things that, there was money issues that came up, divorce and other things. So a lot of stuff. I didn't have, like, the actual writing of it was the easiest part in some way. Like, that was the, and it was a thing where I just had to say, if I don't do this, I'll be really upset the rest of my life that I didn't. So carving out time for myself to work on it. I also was really lucky to get an agent who started really pushing me to get it done, and to submit, and I sold it without having written it yet, which is terrifying, by the way. But the actual creation of the book was mostly very joyous. But yeah, everything else, trying to do life. And it was very ironic to me. And I think that probably it ends up being in the book that I'm writing women's history, and I'm dealing with, like, women's issues, like, day-to-day domestic issues as I'm trying to write it. That are, there's the phrase, the pram in the hall, that was what had kept women from writing, is that they always had to worry about the baby, or they had to worry about keeping the house clean, or they had to, I tidied behind me here, but my house is not tidy, and that's how I managed to write a lot, I think. I just do that, and yeah, but having to decide again, it was about having the confidence of the mediocre white guy, right? Is that I had to decide it was important that I write this, and that I had to like carve out time and put some things to the side so that I wrote it, and that was important. That was, I think, the biggest hurdle. And it took me a long time. I mean, I'm 50, and I wouldn't have done this in my 20s, you know. I hope younger women now, I think, are more empowered to do so. And we were more empowered than our mothers. And so, when, you know, it's been a long journey. Yeah, it took me a while to be like, no, I have to do this. And I'm just gonna do it. Yeah.
So were there specific authors or particular books that inspired you in your own writing?
I think in terms of for writing something like this, Susan Orlean, who's also a friend of mine, just the way that Susan is so good at making things be in her voice and making you feel like you're there with her. But I really, so, and she also wants, and this is, I mean, but she recommended reading it out loud to make sure that it sounds, you know, because you're telling a story, especially when you're doing a nonfiction book where you're guiding people through, making sure that it sounds like you're telling a story. So I think she was definitely, and how you do it as a, you know, being a woman, having, because she's, yeah, I mean, Susan's really good at writing as a woman, as someone who's very smart, who's very professional, who's very all of this, and pulling it all together. So she was definitely, I think, an inspiration for trying to get a voice. And I mean, there were so many. I have like a whole like a thing at the back of all these books that were influences on me. I mean, I think well, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, it still lives with me. And I mean, I did sort of take that as because he doesn't just go linearly through, like he takes little sort of sections of the history and talks about them. So I kind of model myself a little bit on that. Yeah, and then just a lot of, you know, things. Oh, there was a book that I didn't, I'm going to forget it because of the name. But it was a book that was about like the wives in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of Washington, D.C. And I sort of picked it up, and it was like and I didn't expect it to be, I thought it'll be, you know, maybe I'll get some things. And it was so powerful to me that I had never thought about how much we had to create the culture around our democracy. Like, how do we think about the president? How do we think about the cabinet? How do we think about how we interact with those people? And so much of that was done in sort of the background society, and that the women had an influence on that. And it was, so we get, now I'll have to look up what the book is, but just, I feel really bad now that I don't remember it. It was written by Catherine Al Gore, and Parlor Politics. And Catherine Al Gore is actually, she's, I think she's currently still the head at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I just, yeah, I think especially after the 2016 election, thinking about how much Hillary Clinton had accomplished in her life that people didn't understand was important, was kind of staggering, because so much of it was, you know, behind the scenes women's work, and how there's that doesn't get acknowledged as important. You know, there's a book about economics that came out a couple of years ago called "Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner," and it's about, you know, when people talked about economics forever, that there'd be this is how economics work, with no acknowledgement of the fact that there were all of these women doing all this work that was unpaid and unacknowledged, that was keeping the economy going. And so always I try to, you know, mention when, you know, like that and he had a wife who could do, like, or Eleanor Roosevelt could travel around the country because she had nannies, she had people who to watch her kids, that kind of thing. So that's sort of, those were some of the things that influenced me. But I also would like documentary, I ended up talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act because I watched the PBS documentary about it. And because I was doing such short little snippets about history, a lot of times a really well-made documentary would sort of teach me how to talk about something in better than like a whole book. Sometimes I'd read a whole book and that would make it into a paragraph. And then sometimes I'd read a paragraph on something and that would make a whole chapter, that would make me write a chapter. But there were things that I would see. Everything was constantly, everything I watched, everything I read would immediately get filed away. And this is the thing that could go in the book. and I would connect it somehow because I was obsessed, and that's the key. So yeah, so it's hard to even quantify, like it's hard to even be specific about it. No.
As you were growing up, what was media representation like of women, and how do you feel that it has changed since then?
Well, one definite thing is that we were living in this sort of backlash. My mother was a very active feminist, and then by the time I was in middle school, where I was starting to think about being a woman and a grown-up, it was considered really embarrassing to be a feminist. Like you weren't supposed to say you were a feminist. And it was, I remember Madonna wouldn't say she was a feminist, even though it was like really like, oh, yeah, you are, of course you are, but she couldn't say she was a feminist. The only rock star who said she was a feminist was Cyndi Lauper. And I remember that being like a big deal. But there was, so in that way, that got really hard. And there was a lot of there was the backlash, which Susan Faludi writes about in the book Backlash. And there was a lot of women actually should be wearing lingerie, or women are, or not even that. It was women, they would report on television about so many women are wearing lingerie now. And the actual numbers, if you looked at the numbers, actually more women were, Jockey had come out with underwear for women that was based basically on their men's underwear, but like slightly different shapes. Those were selling far more than Victoria's Secret, but the news would report on the Victoria's Secret. And then there was, a woman's more likely to get killed by a terrorist than get married after 35, for instance. That was or whatever. That was this thing that went around, and there was this, and I mean Reagan. Oh, that was terrible. Reagan just was this big, with Nancy looking at him adoringly, even though she was the person, she was the power behind the throne, and look, but sitting back. So yeah, and it became this thing, and then the 90s became this whole, I mean, women were embracing the Playboy symbol and that, it was, and we were supposed to be sexy but independent. I mean, it was a lot. And so there were that was, and it's kind of amazing to look back at it now. I mean, at the same time, there was always, there were the riot girls, and there were underground things going on that were feminist. And the other thing that happened was that, like I who was raised as feminist and later would write a feminist history, got in trouble with the feminist group at my first college for not being feminist enough. Because I had written for this comedy magazine, I'd written a parody of a tampon ad that implied that maybe having your period was not always convenient and it was a little bloody. And my name wasn't on it because it was a parody ad. And the editor of the magazine was cornered by these two women from the feminist group, and they said, "We demand you tell us who wrote that. It's very offensive." And he was like, "I'm not." And then they said, "Well, we know it was a man because no woman would write about her period like that because she knows it's a sacred time." And it was just this like. So there was that too. Is that a lot of the women who'd been in the feminist movement went into academia, and it became like there was this the rigidity about it that happened just because it was very academic, which I think did turn off a lot of younger women, like, but I want to have sex with men. I want to look attractive to men, and I can't, you know? And so I think that this generation, I mean, I'm amazed, like Generation Z is amazing to me, that, you know, you guys are all really active politically. You're very into feminism, you're very into, you know, all sorts of gender stuff, you know, the gender fluidity and sexuality, and just trying to push for it. It's very gratifying to see it. It was really great when people started identifying as feminists again, and young women did. And now, yeah, it's cool. So to see that.
What problems with women's representation do you still see in the media?
Well, I mean, there's always like, you know, there's like Rebecca Traister wrote about, you know, the portrayal of anger, women's anger, right, in her book recently, and you know, showing, there'll be like the woman who they find intimidating just on the news is shown with her mouth open or yelling, or, you know, that kind of thing. So you see that still. There's still a lot of attempts to, you know, that women are still often reduced to their body parts, reduced to what they wear. And it was like shocking to see how Hillary Clinton was covered. And it, you know, you didn't have to like Hillary Clinton, but to see the way she was demonized was shocking. And I had gone through already in 2008 watching, because I'd been a supporter of hers then. And I thought, like, when 2016 came around, like, well, can't be any worse. And then it was. It was so much worse. And so there is still this discomfort with women having power, and women seeking power, that we still don't know what to do with that. But it was amazing to see the Women's March happen. I was there in DC, and it was stunning. Like, it was, I had all these plans, like I knew all these people who were going to be there, and we said, oh yeah, we'll hang out, we'll meet up. I didn't mean that with anybody, because you couldn't, the phones weren't working. It was so packed. We took over the streets. It was just this force. So, and I think I talk a little bit about this in the book, is that particularly white women, I mean, because Black women have been involved for a really long time in politics, but they had to be. White women have always had this privilege of, in theory, you could get married, your husband would represent you out in the world, you would have a safe little sheltered life where you didn't have to think about these things. And yeah, and it's, a lot of white women were like, well, that's so unpleasant. We don't want to talk about politics, it's unpleasant. They feel there's a discomfort with arguing, there's a discomfort with, and also just, as someone, you know, I've written about politics, I've been on TV talking about politics, and there are countless men who feel completely comfortable discussing politics with me as if they know what they're talking about, and they don't. They do not know what they're talking about. And they'll come to me with like, and I'm like, but their wives, they're married to women who think they know what they're talking about. Yeah, they're like, yeah, this guy, my husband, clearly, yeah, I trust his opinion on this. And you're like, don't. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But because men will talk about it like it's sports, you know, and so they have an opinion. Yeah, wait, did that answer the question? I don't remember what the question was now. I've run out of questions, but that's, yeah, that's one of the challenges. Yes.
What do you think is the impact of the male gaze on women as individuals and on society as a whole?
Oof, yeah, the male gaze. Well, I mean, I had to think a lot about, as I've gotten older, how much I worried about that when I was younger. And again, it's, I'm straight. I'm a straight woman, for better or for worse. And so I date men, and you know, I've spent a lot of time, like, how am I supposed to make myself look to be attractive to men? You know, what how much should I think about it? How much should I worry? And then just sort of like how much I look back at movies now, even from like when I was, during my life, not even just like the really old movies, because you expect in like a movie from the 40s that it's going to be kind of sexist. Although sometimes you're surprised at how much less sexist it was than movies that came out in the 80s and 90s. But this kind of how women were portrayed and how we were supposed to see them. There's of course the famous Bechdel test, right? That's like where it's, is there more than one female character? Do they talk to each other? Do they have names? Do they talk to each other? Do they talk to each other about something other than a man? And if that as a qualification for, is this movie balanced in any way? And it's just a very bare minimum. And you realize how much women were put into so many movies that as just this kind of props. And just, and even in literature, how often we're made to feel sympathy for like a serial killer, or a man who's like tormented, or, like reading Catcher in the Rye. And, he's like, oh, and you were, oh, I feel so bad. He's so tormented. And you're like, wait a minute, like, why do I felt bad for that guy? One of my favorite, there's a meme that goes around about this, and I won't be able to quote it properly, but it's about Star Wars, which was one of my favorite movies. And I never thought about this, because here it is, Carrie Fisher's, Princess Leia has lost her entire planet. She's lost all of her family. She's on the run. And then Luke loses one guy. Like, he watches Ben Kenobi die, and there's Princess Leia comforting him. Like, no one's comforting Princess Leia. She watched her whole entire planet get blown up, and she's like, oh, there, Luke. And how that plays into that women are caretakers first, and that men feeling things is when men feel things, that's important. So I guess those are just some. I mean, it's a big topic, but that would be some of the examples I can think of how I had to redirect my own, or seeing myself like as I'm someone who wrote a book. Like I'm someone who wrote a book about history. I'm going to write a book about history, and that I'm going to do this, and seeing myself as not just a mother, or a middle-aged lady or something like that.
So we have a question in the chat. Could you define the male gaze?
Oh, well, the male gaze, that concept originates with the sort of the art world, in that, and you see this you go into a museum, you see this, that women's bodies were, by and large, because the artists were men, they were portrayed in the way that men saw them, and that we became very used to seeing women through that lens, because the artists that were given voice in society were male. So it's true, in writing, it's true in photography, in in painting, and you can see like the if you there's this sort of joke of I forget, there's some award that's given out for this, but there's often people highlighting men writing badly about women's bodies. And there's some hilarious, and they're just like, have you seen, have you ever met a woman? So they'll be like, like guys writing like, and her breasts perked up to see me, or said hello, or, like, what? How did that happen? And just not, or only show, the fact that, as I was saying earlier, I know who got here, that I have cleavage in this because in solidarity with those girls in Florida whose cleavage was, they put a black bar over it, the school, and and you think that's like the people at the school, and and obviously there were probably women who were part of that decision too, but they look at this picture of the girls and all they see is they have boobs, and boobs are boobs are a distraction, and so it's the looking at women's bodies always as from the point of view, and also it's not just male, it's straight men, who, you know, and how they, what they see on the woman's body and how they see her. And that was what was allowed or what was encouraged, and more importantly, what was given money to those artists. The male artists were given money to portray things, which becomes like, so we all start seeing, that's how we see everybody when we look at the media or anything like that.
So now we're going to open up questions to you all. So you can raise your hand and ask the question out loud, or put it in the chat, or private chat me and I can say it out loud. Yeah. Oh, Cami, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
So you've talked a lot about women and voting rights. You also alluded to women getting more involved in understanding politics. Do you think the absurdity of what we have had for the last 4 years has made women more active in understanding the political venue out there?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say it was white women. That was who were the one. I mean, there was always that the you know, approximately 50% of white women voted for Donald Trump, of the women who voted, which was like staggering. But I think what happened was, I mean, I know like there was even I was involved in politics, and I still felt like, oh God, I don't want that in my name. You know, I have to stand up and say something about this. But yeah, I think that there also, the benefit of it is it certainly made the bar really low. Like you didn't have to like, wow, that guy can be president, and so I'll run for Congress, you know, like that's, I can handle this. I mean, he was the ultimate, like just unqualified, just the low, you know, like just had no, like didn't even bother to learn about being president, didn't bother to learn about how the government worked, and just felt like I should be president. And that, I mean, I think that that had a big impact on women. Like, well, then, you know, maybe I could do that too, because it clearly this idiot can. So yeah, I think that was, and there, I think one of and this was something, and because like I said, in 2008, I did support Hillary Clinton in the primary, and then was totally psyched with Obama too, who was great. But my concern was always, people really had a view of him as like, he's just gonna go in and fix everything. Like he's so confident and he's so handsome and he's just gonna, and of course he couldn't because he's the president, you know. I was talking about the bumper stickers I would see around Cambridge, which is where I live. And they would have, you know, Obama, and the O would be a peace symbol. And I think they're gonna be really disappointed. It's like they're voting for like the commander-in-chief of the biggest military in the world, and then they're expecting world peace. That's not gonna happen. So that made, I think, people a little bit too comfortable with, because I mean, he himself would talk about, you know, in like speeches like, where'd you all go? You know, when the midterms came up, and he's like, what happened? Like, we had this great thing, and you all propelled me into office, and you all went away. And the other thing is the moral majority, which was which was sort of started actually with the ERA fight. And then they realized, because the ERA fight, the ERA was defeated in state legislatures. It passed in the national, you know, it passed the Senate, it passed the House. It was signed by President Nixon, and it was very popular. And then it was in the state legislatures that it went down. And that was when the religious right and really conservative people realized, oh, we're just gonna, if we keep our power there, if we run for office there, we can keep defeating things like this. And that's also where you see a lot of anti-birth control, anti-abortion laws being passed in state legislatures. And so you saw people who were religious right people running for, you know, school boards, where they really affected a lot of stuff that went on, and running for, you know, state legislatures and things like that. And those aren't jobs, like people, it's not that much fun to be in a state legislature necessarily. It's a lot of work, it's kind of tedious. And so it was something that people weren't doing, who were kind of middle of the road people. And also then you'd have to go in and deal with these people who didn't believe in evolution. But I think people started that, we're seeing, of course, all these women now entering into that arena and saying, okay, we have to be there, and hopefully in time. The great thing about it was interesting because it was sort of hopeful to see, there were a lot of things that the Trump administration managed to roll back, but there were a lot of things that they couldn't. And a lot of that was because there has been this effort over the years to get better representation in general in all over the government, in terms of, there were people of color in government and who were judges and who were running agencies and who were running and had power in places that was solid, and it was much harder to kind of sweep that away with people who were actually embedded in the government.
So we have an interesting question. How often do you get mansplained?
I not as much, less now. It depends on, I used to think the places I expected to be mansplained were usually like hardware stores. I once had a guy like explain to me how a screwdriver worked. Like, so what you, and I was like, no, I know. I think I have enough of a persona now where men don't try it. But no, it'll still happen. It did actually happen. Actually, that's not true, because in the 2016 election, that was, there were some guys who were explaining like Hillary Clinton's history to me, and I'd be like, no, that's not, or this, let me tell you what, and no, that's not, and it was, although there was just also a lot of, well, she's just unlikable, or, well, she just doesn't excite me, kind of things. But also there was a lot of like, the minute anyone said, well, she's a Goldwater girl, I knew they didn't know what they were talking about, because that was always sort of the go-to, because when she was 16 years old, she'd helped her dad like stuff envelopes for the Goldwater campaign, basically. Anyway, so I sort of am good at, I guess I'm also sort of good at shutting it down now. But the benefit of writing about women's history is men don't think they know about it, because they don't, because they haven't bothered to read it. And so so there are some, I don't know. But sometimes it'll be like, oh, you should include this, or have you heard of this woman? And I get a little of that, but yeah. No.
So our next question is from Nora. What are some of the barriers that make women's history so unknown, and how can we change that?
Again, it's just a lot of it is what's taught in schools, in the same way that that the history of slavery isn't known and things like that. That there are really strong barriers to kids learning about it, and that's of course when people have really learned history. Most people after a certain age don't, unless they're guys, watching war movies, watch the World War II documentaries. But other than that, there's not a lot of effort put into school curriculums. It's changing a little bit, but you can see this resistance now about the 1619 project, right? And the fact, and critical race theory being this big panicky thing, which is, it's because it all is of a piece of where we think of history as being white guys who did cool things. And then, so that's part of it. There's also just what money gets spent on it. It's always about money. What are people willing to spend money on? And I don't mean like necessarily consumers, because so over and over again, consumers are actually get very interested in things that producers think they're not going to be interested in. It took a really long time. You would have these movies starring women that were making tons of money, but you'd still have a hard time selling a movie producer on a movie about women, because they were like, they don't make money. In the same way that, Tyler Perry was making movies with Black people in them that were topping the box office numbers, and you still couldn't get people in Hollywood to make movies with Black people in them. for a long time. So some of it is just that. And there's a great story that Gloria Steinem used to tell about, or still does tell sometimes, about trying to get ads for Ms. Magazine when they first started. And they didn't want to do beauty product ads. They knew how much control that those companies would have over women's magazines. And so they started trying to think of other products. And they realized that women were starting to buy more and more cars, and that, you know, a third of the cars in America were being bought by women. So Gloria Steinem goes with some other people to the car manufacturers and says, hey, we'd love for you to place ads in our magazine aimed towards women to buy cars. And the guy behind the desk would say, women don't buy cars. And she'd say, no, they do. Look, here's all the numbers, and they're, you know, third, and they're, women don't buy cars. And they were just convinced of that. And it was like, and it was just all these guys who were like, nope. Or, you know, if we start doing the ads towards women, you know, men won't buy the cars. But like that, you know, that kind of thing. And so that is part of it. The other part is that, I mean, the thing is, women's history, I mean, so often it's like the story is, and then she didn't get to do it. Like, and then she was stopped. I mean, that's like, which just gets really depressing, honestly, as someone who writes women's history. So that's the other is, it's like often disappointing and frustrating to read, because you end up like, God, you know, like she was so close, and then this happened. So I think that's also part of it, is people really like a narrative where someone wins. Yeah, and so that's part of it. Yeah.
So our next question from Lila is talking about outside of like writing your book. Have you written in online sources like Wikipedia before to try to add more representation for writing about women?
I've done a little. I have a friend, my friend Maya has done that a lot with women scientists, and there are these groups that will get together and they'll all write Wikipedia entries of women's history. It's difficult. Like, I know lots and lots of women historians, or historians in general, who want to write about women in Wikipedia, and it's really hard to get the Wikipedia people to take it seriously. You have the whole thing where you have to prove that this person was important and notable, and they're like, yeah, I don't see it. So that can happen a lot. They ask for lots of stories, and it's very hard, again, because you're talking about women who aren't, you know, they weren't written about, and so you can't go to Wikipedia and say, but look at all the stuff that was written about her, kind of stuff. So that happens too. But like on those, like I have this, I think it's like my 5 greats grandfather, who was he was like a judge in Tennessee, you know, and he's got a Wikipedia entry. I don't know why. I've just noticed this because I look up Deaderick every once in a while. But you can't, yeah, but there are women who did things who are not. One of the things that I realized too, as I wrote this, is that a lot of women's history didn't get written down because there was this circular kind of logic about it. Women didn't do historical important things. So if you see that a woman did something, it must not be important because women don't do important historical things. And so because a woman did it. So that becomes this like, so that it was amazing to me to see the blinders that historians put on to not see the women and what they were doing. And so, and also true with like people of color, anyone who wasn't white, that it was like, I mean, there were some, once I started reading, the history to do the book, I was astounded by how much work, how much effort it must have taken for a lot of these men to write history without mentioning the women. Because I thought, how did you do that? Like, how could you, like, that just took such like a crazy myopic view to not mention like, oh, and then she did this, it's I've been looking at a lot, it's at biblical stuff too. And when you look at, I've been reading a book about Mary Magdalene, and the effort that's gone into making it so that we can pretend that Mary Magdalene wasn't important in the story of Jesus, when it's like, but she's the first person who, like, he told her first about things. She was his closest apostle, all that stuff. But they're like, but you'll see movies about Jesus that she barely even makes a, she barely makes an appearance. And you're like, but so it's this kind of, it's this self-fulfilling thing where, but it's just, I do, like, I can't even, I don't even know how to explain it, except that men really are trained or brought up to not think that women's stuff is important. And men by and large control purse strings and stuff. And again, it's changing, which is nice. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we don't have time for any new questions,
Oh.
but Valerie will put the link to the exit ticket in the chat. So just maybe take a minute and fill it out. Yeah. Any last remarks, Jen?
Oh, geez. Write, I don't know, write your own history books. I guess it's right. Yeah. And buy history books. Although I will, of course, give them free to the Girl Scouts. But yeah, always think about who, like, always, who cooked Adam Smith's dinner, who cooked the dinner, who was making the dinner, who was cleaning the house while this guy, that's the most important question to ask when you're looking at history. And that will reveal things that aren't always talked about. Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Buddy.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Lila. Bye.
Thank you for coming. Remember to fill out the form when you get a chance.
Bye. Thanks.